husband for Mr. Mole's daughter. Once upon a time, there lived Mr. and Mrs. Mole in the village underground. They'd lived without a child of their own for a long time, but finally had a daughter in their old age. They loved their daughter so much that they brought her up like a princess. The baby girl grew up to be old enough to get married. "Honey, who's going to be our Precious's husband?"
The strongest man in the world is, of course.
So who would that be?
Well, I'll go out and look for him.
So Mr. Mole set off to find a husband for his daughter. On his way, Mr. Mole met Mr. Sun. Lighting this wide world evenly, Mr. Sun seemed to be the strongest man in the world. Mr. Mole asked Mr. Sun,
Mr. Sun, you're the strongest man in the world. Will you marry my daughter?"
Mr. Sun shook his head and replied,
"Mr. Mole, I'm afraid that Mr. Cloud is stronger than me. If he ever screams me, the whole world becomes dark right away."
So Mr. Mole climbed up the high mountains to see Mr. Cloud. And then he asked politely,
Mr. Cloud, you're the strongest man in the world. Will you marry my daughter?"
Mr. Cloud replied, waving his hand,
"Actually, Mr. Mole, Mr. Wind is much stronger than me. If he ever blows me out, I'll be gone within a second."
So Mr. Mole walked and walked to see Mr. Wind. And then he asked politely,
Mr. Wind, you're the strongest man in the world. Will you marry my daughter?"
Mr. Wind replied with his eyes wide open,
"But, Mr. Mole, Mr. Stone Buddha is far stronger than me. However strong a wind I blow to him, he doesn't even move a muscle."
So Mr. Mole went to see Mr. Stone Buddha with all the might he had left, and asked him politely,
Mr. Stone Buddha, you're the strongest man in the world. Will you please marry my daughter?"
Smiling gently, Mr. Stone Buddha replied,
"Mr. Mole, young Mr. Mole is a lot stronger than me. If he ever digs in the ground under me, I will just collapse."
Mr. Mole scratched his head and said,
"Oh, I didn't notice the great man who was just around me."
Mr. Mole came back to his town underground. Then he visited the strongest young man in the town and asked,
"Young Mr. Mole, you're the strongest man in the world. Will you marry my daughter?"
Young Mr. Mole was very happy. After a few days, there was a big wedding for young Mr. and Mrs. Mole. They had strong baby moles and lived happily ever after.